Good afternoon, and welcome to EntryPoint, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them. I'm Patty Miller, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's program on the Albemarle Barracks, which is co-sponsored by the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. For those of you who aren't familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, we're a free, reliable multimedia resource on the history and culture of Virginia that tells the inclusive story of Virginia for anyone who wants to understand how the past informs the present and the future. You can learn about the entries we'll be talking about today and all the entries at Encyclopedia Virginia at encyclopediavirginia.org. And I'm dropping a link in the chat to our new entry on the Albemarle Barracks, so you can check that out after we're done today. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We will have time for some questions from our presenters, so please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to drop your questions into the chat for later. And also, the event does have closed captioning, and you can use the closed captioning button at the bottom of the Zoom panel to turn on closed captioning and adjust the settings for that. And now I'm super pleased to be introducing today's guests. Olivia Brown is the executive director of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. Travis Shaw is the director of education at the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area and the author of our new entry on the Albemarle Barracks. And Katie Garrett is the media editor here at Encyclopedia Virginia. Olivia, tell us a little bit about the work of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Patty. We are really happy to be partnering with Encyclopedia Virginia on this program, and so glad all of you could be joining us. As Patty mentioned, my name is Olivia Brown. I'm the executive director at the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. We are the local historical society for both the county of Albemarle and the city of Charlottesville. And we really represent both the county and city's history as far back as it goes and as many people as it includes. So our mission here is to collect, preserve, and share that history. And we do so in various ways. We collect and preserve both artifacts and archives. And we share through partnered programming like this one, in addition to other programs, walking tours, and things that we do. We're a private nonprofit organization. We encourage membership for those who are interested in learning more about what we do. And I'll be happy to put in the chat a link to our website as well. And we really enjoy being able to highlight what others are doing to participate in this local history too. So, being able to join for this program that is talking about the Albemarle Barracks was a natural place for us to come in and share that history and look forward to learning more about it ourselves, because we are always learning about our local history. Hopefully, for those who are joining us who don't know much about what we do, you'll check out our website, learn more about our membership, or attend some of our programs if you are here locally. We do have a lot going on. We're, of course, as many other people, doing things for the 250th as well, which factors in, I think, to what we'll talk about today. So I'm really pleased to be here and to support the work that you all have done at Encyclopedia Virginia and that, Travis, you have written into this entry. So thank you so much for having us, and look forward to being part of today's program.
Thanks, Olivia. And please do go ahead and drop into the chat the website address for the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society.
Will do.
Great. And now Travis is going to take it away and tell us about the Albemarle Barracks for everyone who ever wondered what Barracks Road or the Barracks Shopping Center was about.
Great. Thank you so much, Patty. And thanks to Virginia Humanities for having me today. This is a really wonderful chance to talk about a topic, as Olivia said, that's very relevant to the 250th. So the story of the Albemarle Barracks begins hundreds of miles away from Virginia. And it's going to begin with the British Army under the command of General John Burgoyne. This is a massive army that had been sent to Canada with the intention of invading the northern colonies, kind of cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies by coming down the Champlain Valley, down the Hudson Valley. And this army is going to suffer two serious defeats at the hands of the Americans in the fall of 1777. We usually refer to them as the Battle of Saratoga, but really it's two battles. Freeman's Farm on September 19th, and then Bemis Heights on October 7th. And after these two setbacks, Burgoyne realizes that he is not going to be able to achieve his goal. He's surrounded essentially, is running low on supplies, and so he will surrender to the Americans in October of 1777. And this is really, at this point in the war, an unprecedented situation. We had taken British prisoners before, we had defeated British forces before, but never to this scale. So this opens us up to the problem of what do we do with thousands and thousands of prisoners? And, initially it's going to be very confusing. So we're talking about 6,000 or so prisoners. And this really kind of showcases the diversity of the British Army at this point. We're not just talking about soldiers from the British, Ireland and Great Britain, but we're also talking about Germans from Hesse-Hanau, Brunswick. We're talking about Native Americans, American loyalists, Canadians. It's really kind of a motley collection. And these 6,000 odd prisoners are kind of bound by what's known as the Convention of Saratoga. And this is kind of one of those 18th century niceties that these surrendering troops will be offered all of the honors of war. They are supposed to be paroled. And what that means is that the convention says they will be sent back to England and under the promise that they will not take up arms in America again. And, this is, like I said, kind of one of those 18th century kind of gentlemen's agreements. And as we'll see, it breaks down very, very quickly. But these surrendered troops, the loyalists, the natives, the Canadians essentially go home. They go back to Canada, leaving, roughly 4,000 or so British and German troops that march into camps in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the winter of 1777. And they basically sit in Cambridge for a year as negotiations drag on as to what to do with all of these prisoners. There's a feeling within the Continental Congress that if we just let them go back to Britain, then that's going to free up troops to come here and fight. It doesn't really solve the problem. They'll just lead to more British and German troops being sent over. So Congress is very hesitant to honor the terms of the convention. And they essentially come up with what I think of as a loophole. They refuse to ratify the convention until King George ratifies it, knowing full well that the British will not ratify the convention because that would be kind of de facto admission that the United States is independent. And so these poor soldiers are kind of stuck in Massachusetts for a year. They're running very low on supplies. The British government is supposed to be funding them, sending over money to pay for their upkeep. But that doesn't help with the scarcity of supplies in Massachusetts at this point. Conditions are going to be pretty bad for these guys. There's going to be hundreds of desertions while they're in Massachusetts. There's a really great eyewitness account from a Massachusetts woman named Hannah Winthrop, who refers to the men of the Convention Army as dirty and emaciated. Along with the men who are in captivity, there are hundreds of women and children who had followed the army. This is a fact of life for any 18th century army. You're going to have women doing a lot of the logistical work, traveling with the army. And, she refers to them as beasts of burden. So, you get this image of, this army that had been on campaign through some of the roughest terrain in North America. These guys are tired, they're dirty, they've been through a lot, and they're just kind of sitting, wasting away in these camps in Massachusetts. And so by October of 1778, we're a year into the saga. There's a realization that we need to come up with a permanent solution for these prisoners. They're not going back to Britain at this point. The convention is not going to be honored. And so the Board of War is going to order what they refer to as a, quote, temporary log barracks to be built near Charlottesville. Now, why Charlottesville? The biggest concern here is that we need someplace far from the Atlantic Ocean, far from the coast. The British, with the most powerful navy in the world, have the ability to land soldiers wherever they want, essentially. And there's a fear that they might try to have a rescue operation to try and free these prisoners. Charlottesville is, 150, almost 200 miles away from the Atlantic coast. It's way up in the Piedmont, kind of far from any major roads or highways or anything like that. And so the belief is that, the chances of them being rescued are pretty slim. There's also, again, supply is a big concern. You were talking about thousands of people, 4,000 people. That's twice the population of Williamsburg at this point. This is basically a city of people. Where do you keep them? Where you can keep them fed and clothed and have all the necessities that they need. And, by this point in the war, Virginia has really escaped any major military operations, particularly, the Piedmont of Virginia. So they come up with some land. It is several hundred acres along Ivy Creek, about 5 miles or so northwest of Charlottesville, and it's land owned by John Harvey. John Harvey is a planter, a lawyer, a close friend of Thomas Jefferson's. They had kind of grown up together, and also a member of the Continental Congress. So, very well connected individual. And he is going to donate this land. Not donate it, that's the wrong word. He's going to provide this land. And the actual setup of the camp is going to fall to a guy named Captain George Rice, who works for the Quartermaster Corps. Rice is essentially, they allocate $23,000 to build quarters for roughly 4,000 prisoners. So this is a major undertaking. As I said, this would have made the Albemarle Barracks one of the largest cities in Virginia at this point. If you're planning on 4,000 people kind of setting up a community in what was essentially, not the frontier, but not too far removed from the frontier. We're not talking about a well-settled part of Virginia at this point. So they have to clear the land. A lot of the clearing is going to be done by enslaved people who belong to John Harvey. They are going to start setting up these log barracks. And while they're working on it, preparations are being made to move these prisoners south. So again, we've got somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 prisoners, soldiers, women, children. They are going to depart from Massachusetts in stages. Again, how you can't feed all these people and keep them sheltered all at once. So we have to kind of move them in packets of people. The first is going to leave Massachusetts on November 9th. And then the other groups will kind of set off in subsequent days to kind of stagger the movement of these people. And this is actually, I'm so glad that Katie's here today, because the best part of this article isn't what I wrote. It's the story map that was created to show their journey. It is a really remarkable trip, and it's very well documented. One of the Germans who's part of the Convention Army, August Wilhelm Duroy, or Duroy, I guess would be, he keeps a very detailed journal kind of depicting their journey from Massachusetts through New England, down through New York and Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, they're going to pick up what was known at the time as the Carolina Road, which runs from central Pennsylvania across Maryland and down into Virginia. These guys are, expected to make about 10 to 15 miles a day. The rations are very, very scarce during their trip. It's an exhausting journey. They're going to lose a lot of people to desertion as they move, particularly these Germans, as they're moving through German communities in Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, Virginia. The temptation to desert is very, very strong. So the weather's pretty good for most of the march. Surprisingly, as we're in late fall, early winter, it doesn't really turn bad until they reach the Potomac River crossing. They're going to cross at Nolan's Ferry, which is one of the main river crossings on the Potomac, just outside of Leesburg, Virginia, in Loudoun County. The weather turns very cold. The river is choked with ice. One of the British officers has this great quote about once they've reached Virginia, they're walking through snow that had been crusted in ice, and they keep kind of falling through the ice and banging their shins and ankles on the ice. So those of us who had to go through that ice storm a few months ago, I kept thinking about that as I was trying to shovel my driveway. So it's a miserable journey. Another great eyewitness account comes to us from Baroness Riedesel, whose husband was a German general. She had accompanied the army the entire way on its campaign through New York. She goes into captivity with her husband and her children, and she writes about what this journey is like, and she refers to Virginia as picturesque, but by reason of its wildness, inspired us with terror. So you get this sense that of foreboding as they're going into Virginia. She also referred to Northern Virginia's breakneck roads, which again, as someone who lives here in Northern Virginia, I think that hasn't changed much. But here's a woman who has come from a position of extreme kind of affluence and really roughed it with her husband, sharing in the struggles of her husband and the soldiers. And to have someone who survived this military campaign refer to the terror of coming into the wilderness of Virginia, I think really speaks to the landscape, speaks to the again the sense of foreboding and unknown of what they're going to see when they get to Albemarle. So they begin arriving at the barracks in January, again, kind of arriving in stages. And what they find there is, I think, profoundly disappointing. Most of the huts were unfinished at this point, or so poorly constructed that they're pretty much uninhabitable. DeRoy, again, in his account, actually said that the men preferred to camp in the woods rather than stay in the huts. And it's really up to them to kind of improve them and put them into some sort of livable condition. The camp itself, we have a good description of what it would have looked like. It was arranged in a grid of 7 squares. Each square had 4 rows of 12 huts. Now, I'm a history guy. I don't really do a lot of math, but I think that's 336 huts in total. These huts are 24 by 14 feet, and they're supposed to house 18 men, or 18 people, I should say, because again, we have to remember a large proportion of these prisoners are women and children. So 18 people to a hut, 24 by 14 foot. And the way that those squares are kind of arranged, there is half of the camp is set aside for British prisoners, the other half for Germans, with a broad road kind of leading between them. As far as the siting of the camp, it's not really an ideal location. One of the biggest problems through its entire occupation is going to be fresh water. There's no really readily accessible sources of fresh water. Food is going to continue to be a problem as well for these troops. Now, for the officers, it's a very different story. Through their journey from Massachusetts, of course, the officers are, by the terms of the convention, they have their horses, they have carriages. They're going to be not traveling on foot. They're going to be traveling ahead of the main group of prisoners. They're going to be staying in inns and taverns along the way. They generally have a warm, dry place and a hot meal every night as they journey. And when they arrive in Albemarle County, they are going to essentially be responsible for finding their own accommodations. They don't have to stay in the camp. As officers on parole, they have a great deal of freedom in terms of leaving the camp. Some of them are allowed to go as far as Richmond. Most of them will end up staying in private homes, either as guests or renting them out from homeowners. A good example of this, General Phillips, who's one of the British generals, is going to stay at Blenheim, which is a plantation house owned by Richard Carter. So these officers are certainly not lacking for accommodations, and they're not lacking for entertainment either. This is going to be kind of a boon for the social scene in Albemarle County, such as it is. These officers are going to provide, they're going to be guests. Thomas Jefferson himself is going to entertain officers at Monticello. He is going to help some of these officers find accommodations. There's a little bit of grumbling within the officer corps that, the prisoners who had arrived first took up all the best lodgings. And so they're kind of scrambling to find places to stay. But they're going to pass their time at the Albemarle Barracks, kind of going to concerts, theatrical productions. Jefferson will actually visit the camp on several occasions as a guest of these British and German officers for theatrical productions that are being put on in camp. Jefferson himself writes to General Phillips saying, the great cause which divides our countries is not to be decided by individual animosities. So it kind of gives you a sense of, there's no animosity between Jefferson and these other kind of planter elites in Albemarle County and these British and German generals. They're all of one social class, and they're all kind of enjoying the same entertainments. So as winter gives way to spring, 1779, the weather is going to improve, and with that, the camp will improve as well. It's going to give the prisoners a chance to improve the huts that they're living in. They're also going to begin building what becomes a de facto city, a self-contained community. They're going to build churches, they're going to build stores and taverns, a coffee shop, a theater, which I kind of mentioned earlier. Jefferson's going to visit the theater there. And they're also going to start planting gardens and raising livestock as a way to kind of supplement their rations, improve the health of the prisoner community. And so you can imagine by 1779, early 1780, this has completely transformed the community in Albemarle County. It's created an economic boom. These British and German prisoners are being paid for by the British government. So there's an influx of hard currency, which is going to really help a lot of the local merchants and landowners. These prisoners rely on them for food and other necessities, which they are going to sell gladly to the prisoners at greatly inflated prices. It's also going to bring a boom in labor. A lot of these prisoners are going to rent out their labor to farmers and craftsmen in the neighborhood. So you can imagine, just the boost in productivity that we're going to see in this community. And as I said, it's basically a self-sufficient town with over 4,000 people. Again, we're talking about something that is about twice the size of Williamsburg. Now, one of the biggest concerns at the camp, obviously these are prisoners of war, is going to be security. They had built a wooden stockade around a portion of the camp. There's, again, the hope that its remote location is going to prevent soldiers from running away. And security, physical security, is going to be secure or provided by local militia for the large part. Many of the surrounding counties, not just Albemarle County, but Amherst, Culpeper, Orange County, are all going to call up companies of militia, usually 100 men at a time, for kind of rotating 3-month tours. Your job is to go to the Albemarle Barracks, provide security for 3 months, and then go home. They'll send 100 more men. It's kind of rotating group of guards. Those guards are going to be supplemented by state forces as well. Crockett's Western Battalion, which is a state battalion that was raised to guard the western frontier of Virginia. They're going to spend some time at the barracks as well. And in December 1778, the same time the prisoners are on their way and the camp is being built, Virginia actually authorizes a regiment of 600 men specifically to guard this camp. Becomes known as the Virginia Regiment of Guards, or it's a 1-year enlistment under the command of Colonel Francis Taylor, who's an Orange County resident and a veteran of several campaigns at this point. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is, not only are they kind of being guarded by local men, but these guards are being fed and equipped much better than most Continental Army troops are at this time, because there's a desire to kind of project that the American Army is doing so well. Look how well fed these men are. Look how well clothed they are. Kind of project strength to these British prisoners. So there's a bit of a psychological aspect to this. We want to show the British, particularly the British officers, that we are not the ragtag kind of mess that they think we are. That we are, a powerful country who is able to equip our men well. So the barracks themselves, one of the most fascinating parts of the story is just kind of how ephemeral this community is. The prisoners begin arriving in January of 1779, but by the fall of 1780, they actually begin evacuating the barracks. In October of 1780, the British land in Portsmouth. There's a fear that, if the British establish themselves in Virginia, maybe they'll try this massive prison breakout that we had feared back in Massachusetts. And so in the fall of 1780, they begin marching the British prisoners out. About 1,200 men, women, and children are evacuated from the barracks and sent north into Maryland. Of course, we know that more British troops are on their way. Benedict Arnold is going to land with a force in the Tidewater there early in 1781. That's going to be reinforced by Phillips and by Cornwallis eventually. So with this big buildup of British troops, the decision is made by February that we need to get all of the prisoners out of here. So February of 1781, the Germans are finally evacuated. They're sent initially to Winchester and then on to Maryland. And February of 81 is the last time that prisoners will be held there. So we're talking about January of 79 to February of 81. So roughly 2 years this community is in existence. And the camp is abandoned. Harvey actually wants to sell what's left of the camp. He sends there's an inspection done of the property. He's looking to sell off and kind of recoup as much as he can from the construction of this camp. But there's really nothing left. The prisoners had burned about a third of the structures on their way out. And what remained was kind of scavenged by locals. They're not going to let good, useful lumber and nails and hardware and other things go to waste. So the locals kind of descend on the camp and pick it apart piece by piece. So there's really nothing left. And that's the story that we're left with today. There's no physical reminders of the barracks. There's no structures that remain or anything like that. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, we do have reminders in the place names that we see down in the Charlottesville area. You mentioned Barracks Road being one of them. Barracks Road is named after the barracks, of course. It's also where the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, their historic wayside sign is there. There's a few other locations in the area. Of course, there's a Hessian Road, there's Hessian Hills, and other places. So that's really the lasting evidence or lasting reminders we have of this community that for 2 years was one of the largest cities in Virginia. So it's a really interesting and remarkable story, and as I said, so relevant to the 250th. We tend to focus so much on the military campaigns and the battles, which of course Virginia has its fair share, in 1781, culminating at Yorktown. But for most of the war, the experience of the average everyday Virginian is going to be, prisoners of war marching across the state. My good friend and coworker Ian McDougall's done a ton of research on early war prisoners being held in places like Fauquier County, Orange County, Loudoun County. The experience of people who are working the farms and working their trades to support the war effort, and they're also going to end up, as I said, feeding and supporting these prisoner populations. That's, I think, the experience for the majority of Virginians, and I think it's a fascinating story to tell.
Thank you so much, Travis. It is really fascinating. And now we're going to turn to Katie, who is going to show us a map. One of the big advantages we have at Encyclopedia Virginia as a multimedia digital resource is we could kind of take these entries off the page and create living resources that illustrate them in ways that just words can't. The journey this Convention Army makes is a pretty amazing journey. And because they were eager to keep them away from the coasts, it was a pretty much a backcountry journey. So Katie's going to share a little bit of that and allow us to visualize just what an amazing trek this was. Keeping in mind, many of these officers had their families with them. They had their wives with them. They had children. Some of these women would have been pregnant. I did drop a entry into the chat about women camp followers during the war, both on both the British side and the American side. There were many families accompanying these soldiers. So as Katie's walking us through this a little bit, imagine doing this not just by yourself, but with your family with you. So Katie, share a little bit of that for us.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about the work I put into the map, and thank you for your kind words about it, Travis. It was fun to make. So my name's Katie Garrett. I'm the media editor with Encyclopedia Virginia. So once our entries are nice and tidy and edited and finished, they come to me, and I try to find media items, images, anything interactive. Benefit of being an online encyclopedia is we can make things a little bit more interactive. So I was sent this entry about the Albemarle Barracks, and as I was doing research, there's an entire section about how strenuous this journey south was. And I thought an obvious way to illustrate that would be a map. So first I checked to see if a map already existed, and then I saw the maps that did exist were drawing from these primary source journals. And because we have access to I'm not a coder, I'm not somebody who's an expert at all of this tech, but we have access to ArcGIS story maps. And I thought that this was a pretty obvious way to use story maps to make an interactive map. So it's not just showing where everybody went, it is showing you. You can click around, you can see everything, you can get more details. So here is what the story map looks like when you open it up. Convention Army moves south. If you scroll down, uh, there are a lot of primary source journals that I could have chosen from to take the information and take these locations. I ended up settling on one from an officer from Duroy and one from an enlisted man from Johann Benza because it shows the differences between the experiences of the officers traveling and the men who are oftentimes, as Travis said, camping in the woods if they don't have a place to stay. Now, on a sort of behind the scenes tech side of this, the map that I use to illustrate this is actually intended to be used by like people advertising your Airbnb locations or your tours, like for your websites. But what it gives you is a way to put a location in. You can style the map the way you want it, and then when you go down, you can click on a site and it gives you the opportunity to add more images, more context, more quotes. So what I ended up doing was if there was a interesting quote about some of these places, I did not use every single stop that is in these journals. That would have just been overwhelming. So if you're looking for this as like this is not a source of every single diary entry or stop that these men made on the trip. They are sort of an overview, so you get an idea of where they went and some tidbits of interesting quotations. Now, the images that I used, at first I considered not using any images because I didn't know exactly what they would add. But what I ended up doing was because the map that you use for the background is a modern map, it shows you things like highways, which is not what these men were experiencing. So for the images, I would choose as close to I could get to a contemporary map from the time that they were traveling. So you can see from this one, you can actually see the Winter Hill Fort, which was where the enlisted men were staying outside of Cambridge. Um, so I tried to find something like that for each stop, and I would include a quote from Benza or Duroy if there was one that I thought was interesting or described the hardships. Some of the highlights of the quotes. I like the one where they stop in Wilbraham. They said they lost their drivers. Here, the drivers refused to stay with us any longer. They fully proved themselves to be citizens of the state of Massachusetts, not to be governed so easily. Duroy is a little bit funny in his journal sometimes, and they're very you can see them being honest and exhausted. Benza, the enlisted man, he's usually writes something pretty short, but when he does describe an area, it's usually something interesting. So scroll down. The other section, as Travis mentioned, is as they're traveling through Pennsylvania, they go through some areas that are very heavily German. Um, and they do mention that they're sort of excited about this. They get to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He says, our hopes of being received in this town by our countrymen in a hospitable manner were cruelly deceived. Most of them had to be forced by the escort to let the officers have room in their houses. They behaved altogether very mean to us. But then they get a little bit later. They go through York, Pennsylvania, and then in Hanover. He says, they received us very well indeed, which reconciled us a little with our countrymen. um, so I tried to use quotes that added a little something that would be interesting. If you have the time to click through, you can click through any way that you want. And then once again, tying in with what Travis was talking about, once they get into Virginia, when I was trying to find those contemporary maps, a lot of the places they mentioned stopping don't even appear on the maps. I use a lot of Fry Jefferson map, but they don't go into the detail. So Leesburg, I was able to find the little plat of the town. But they described it as the city of Leesburg, has about 50 houses, which are badly constructed. It is a wretched place. And you get a little insight. And then the maps are lower quality because a lot of these areas are not built up cities yet. The men describe uh, how the houses are so far apart. And a lot of the German officers are kind of shocked by scenes of slavery that they see here. They said on all plantations are a great many black slaves, which often run around naked because clothes are too expensive. I saw myself a girl of rank being served a drink by a Negro of about the same age who had no clothes on at all. So I thought it was valuable to add some of these like primary observations as you're getting an overview of where everybody was stopping. And then finally, they arrive at long last in Albemarle County, Virginia. So I finish with the one image that we have of the Albemarle Barracks, which isn't 100% accurate to what it looked like, but you can get an idea. And then I use sort of their long quotes because everyone then they arrived in Charlottesville exhausted. It's winter, it's cold, are horrified at the fact that they have to live in these log houses that aren't even finished. It says in one case that uh, uh, a hole is made in the middle of each hut, which a door is fastened. Everything is just put together without nails. Windows are superfluous. Fresh air, rain having free passage. No chimney is needed for the same reason. The walls are just open in these barracks. So you can see why a lot of people chose to camp out in the woods rather than stay here. So that's a little quick overview and then take you right back to the entry. So feel free to check that out if you have time. Click through. I just thought it was a good way to tell the story and give you a little bit more detail about this uh, journey south. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And I did drop a link to the story map into the chat so you can check that out as well. So we do have some questions for you all. Our first question, I think, is for Travis. Travis, you mentioned 6,000 POWs taken at Saratoga, but then 4,000 left Boston. So how did we lose 2,000 people from Boston?
Well, I mean, number one is that a lot of these numbers are a little squishy to begin with. When Burgoyne surrenders, it's estimated around 6,000 men. That's He's going to lose some of them because that's counting like loyalists and Canadians who leave. Several hundred of them go back to Canada. While the Convention Army is staying in Massachusetts, it's estimated that about 8,000, or excuse me, 800 men will desert from the army there. So kind of the best estimate when the orders are given by the Board of War, it's to prepare lodging for about 4,000 people. And, it's somewhere between 3 and 4,000 that end up making the march down to Virginia. There's just a tremendous amount of attrition, both in Massachusetts and during the march. And once they arrive in Virginia, you have a lot of desertions, hundreds of desertions. So that is, again, we're kind of working with round figures, but, of the 6,000 that surrender, about 4,000 end up, being in the Convention Army in Massachusetts and making the trip. So.
And presumably, you did mention that the British were paying for some of their food and their care, so I guess they had to give them returns on how many people they were supporting approximately.
Yes. And this is kind of a convention in the Revolutionary War and throughout the 18th century, is that, prisoners of war are supposed to be supplied, provisioned by their country. British and German prisoners would be supplied by the British, and, American POWs in British hands are supposed to be provisioned by the Continental Congress. But as we can imagine, that wasn't always the case. Between supply shortages, funds not being there, and so forth, that system breaks down pretty quickly.
And one of the most interesting things about this is there's obviously a very high desertion rate here. As people are passing through a lot of the German speaking areas, a lot of the Germans just they just meld into the population. And when
Mhm.
you think about this as an aftermath of the war, how many Germans ended up becoming Americans basically because they just kind of walked away when they were going through these places.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining it was hard to guard them. I mean, there was probably a long spread out column. You couldn't necessarily guard everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, when you mentioned earlier talking about, women and children and women who are pregnant, and you got to think about this is the wintertime disease and exposure are going to play a role in this. That march is incredibly drawn out and spread out. And it's impossible to guard these guys the entire way. Security does seem to be fairly lax in general because these men were theoretically, at least under the terms of the convention, were supposed to be paroled, which meant that it was on their honor that they would not try to you know run away and rejoin the army and rejoin the fight. Um, so it's uh, there's a lot, as you said, just a lot of desertion and attrition the whole way.
And of course, the Germans were mercenaries, so they really had no attachment to the cause. If they could walk away into some town in Pennsylvania, why wouldn't you do that, really?
Right, exactly, exactly. And the kind of the oral history, at least, in the part of Virginia that I'm in the Shenandoah Valley, is that, I always like to joke that anytime you find any building made out of stone or stone wall or a mill or anything like it was built by Hessians. That's always the story that we get. And, whether or not that's true, I think it speaks to the kind of cultural memory of the Hessians and particularly the deserters who end up settling in these areas and who kind of end up marrying into these pre-existing German communities.
And do we have a sense what happened to the prisoners who did return, were evacuated from the barracks and then eventually returned overseas? Did they all go home to England? Do we know what happened to most of them?
My understanding, and this is just kind of a very broad, is that most of the British troops will return to Britain. The German troops, there's been a lot of great scholarship lately about German soldiers in the American Revolution, and my kind of general understanding is that maybe a third of them or so end up staying in America. And that's across the board, not just the Convention Army, but the Yorktown prisoners and other prisoners of war as well. Um,
Which is a significant number given the population of the United States at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we in terms of raw numbers, we're talking out a few thousand people, which is, not inconsiderable. Um, yeah, the prisoner of war experience during the American Revolution, it varies dramatically depending on who you are and who captured you. Very infamously, American prisoners captured by the British are held on these prison ships in places like New York and Charleston, where disease is just rampant. These men are held in very close quarters. They're going to die by the scores. Thousands of American prisoners will end up dying from these conditions. Um, and that can be compared very closely to the way that American loyalist prisoners are being treated by their countrymen. Many of these loyalist prisoners would be confined in mines and things like that, actually being kept below the ground. They're going to be, forced into hard labor. Many of the formerly enslaved people that join the British, if they are captured by the Americans, they end up being either returned to slavery or being sold. um, it could be very dramatically different. The Americans kind of as a whole treat the Hessian prisoners, the German prisoners, fairly well because there's the idea that these guys can be convinced not to go back. They can either stay or even be recruited into the American army.
And for folks either locally to Charlottesville, or for people who aren't familiar with this area, can you give us a sense, as we said, the camp kind of disappeared at the end. Where is it located, given kind of landmarks in Charlottesville people might know about?
Oh boy. I'm gonna actually cheat a little bit and pull up my Google Maps here because I have it like pinned on here. Just give me a second. So it's roughly, as I said, about 5 miles northwest of town, out along Ivy Creek. So we're talking just past the country club, Farmington Country Club, out in that region. So if you go up Barracks Road, um, off in that direction, looking at the name of the neighborhood, Inglecrest, out in that direction. If that means anything to anyone,
I
Rustling Oaks.
believe the actual marker is on Barracks Farm Road, which is a
Yeah,
ways out of town. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, out kind of in the direction of the Oakencroft Farm and Winery. Not quite there, but along the north bank of Ivy Creek.
And so the question a lot of people want to know, has any archaeology ever been done there? And has anyone ever found any artifacts from the site?
Oh, absolutely. There's been both kind of professional archaeology done as well as, a lot of amateur, like metal detectorists and collectors have gone out there over the years. And there's a wealth of material that comes out of this area. A lot of just kind of everyday goods, the things that you would expect people to have, ceramics and glass, kind of kitchenware and things like that, cutlery, a lot of clothing items, buttons attributed to different regiments that were kept out there. Um, some military items, but just a wealth of material objects.
But there's no physical site left that you could
No,
visit.
not nothing that you can go out and see. Most of the site is on private property now, so or several properties, so you just can't go out and visit it, unfortunately.
To talk a little bit more about the POW experience and just how POWs were viewed, someone, I don't know if you know the detail of this, but when we say the officers were well treated, was that officers with the rank of lieutenant and above? I don't know if you know the detail of who was treated, but it is interesting how Jefferson and everyone saw them as of their class and not an enemy and had them to their homes, which seems very odd to us nowadays. Especially as you said, other prisoners are dying on prison ships in New York Harbor, and then people are wining and dining with Thomas Jefferson. That's an interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, and I think it really speaks to this 18th century concept of, kind of what it means to be a gentleman of a certain social class. Um, you know, from my understanding, this is going to apply to any commissioned officer. So to answer your question, lieutenants, captains, and above. Although, obviously the higher rank you are, the more kind of leeway you get. But regardless, you're still considered as an officer, you're still considered a gentleman of a certain class. And there's a lot of visiting that goes on. As I said, Jefferson gets directly involved in helping some of these guys find places to live. Um, there's a number of the local plantation houses are rented out. These guys are living as guests to some of the first families in the area. It's a whole different world than what the enlisted men are experiencing. There's a lot of in Jefferson's writings and in other writings. General Phillips has a lot of correspondence about this in his writings. Um, Baroness von Riedesel talks about it. They're going to dinner parties, they're going to concerts, they're spending time, you know, talking with Jefferson about politics and things like that. It's just I don't even know how to describe because it is so strange and foreign to us. It seems so bizarre, but they would have seen themselves as part of the same kind of educated and well-connected class.
And probably
Very
happy for the company and their hard currency.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to disparage Charlottesville, but in 1780, it's not really, it's not what it is today. There's no university. These people are kind of starved for company out there. And
And
to have, all of a sudden this influx of wealthy, well-educated, well-mannered people really is a huge boost to the social scene, and as you said, the hard currency that they're going to bring, and the currency that the British government is paying to provision these guys, that's going straight into the pockets of these locals in Albemarle County. So it really, at a time when continental money is near worthless, when the state of Virginia is imposing tremendous taxes to support this war that's been going on, it really does help the people in the area.
And Jefferson actually hired some of the soldiers to do woodwork on his house, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not uncommon. I mean, plenty of these soldiers had skilled trades, and they're going to apply those trades in the area, and get compensated for it. So it's kind of a win-win for a lot of these prisoners. They get to leave the prison camp, they get to make a little bit of money, and the locals get their labor.
And someone asked if the treatment of the POWs, not the officers obviously, would be seen today as abusive, in terms of having them march through the weather. There was no Geneva Convention, obviously. There was no standard for prisoner treatment in that time.
No, I mean, there's a sort of, again, kind of gentleman's agreement sense that you treat prisoners the way that you would want your men to be treated should they be taken captive. And as we've discussed, that system doesn't always work out. It kind of breaks down. Um, Part of that may be due to maliciousness, but a lot of it is just due to the realities of logistics at the time. Um, when you talk about how do we move and house and feed and clothe thousands of people all at once, I mean, the Continental Army can barely afford to feed and clothe itself, let alone take care of prisoners. The other reality is anytime you get that many people in one place at one time, kind of packed cheek to jowl, disease is going to take an incredible toll. Um, the treatment of the prisoners at the Albemarle Barracks, in terms of the actual direct treatment by the guards and so forth, there was probably fairly lenient, if anything. The real hardships are going to come from things like the weather, lack of food, lack of clothing, and disease. The same sort of problems that are going to affect not just prisoners, but soldiers in the field.
So we have two questions, and this is great because one of our viewers is answering the question for another one of our viewers. So someone's wondering if we have any knowledge about any of the POWs who got married or had relationships with local people here in Charlottesville. And then another one of our viewers has an ancestor who was Hessian in the Revolutionary War and stayed here after, settling in central VA, just a couple dozen miles from the barracks. So the answer is obviously yes. That person is wondering if there's any kind of roster of the Hessian soldiers who were confined.
One of the best sources, and I'm blanking on it right now, there's a historian and genealogist actually compiled a list of all of the Hessians that deserted and remained in Virginia that we know of. And I'm sure it will come to me at some point, or maybe I'm hoping Ian is somewhere in the comments there that he could respond, because my coworker was just looking at this the other day. We were remarking on how comprehensive it is. So there's been a particular interest among genealogists who are same situation as our viewer, who had an ancestor who deserted and remained. Those sources are out there, and oh, gosh, I wish I could remember the name of this book. But it's a book specifically on German deserters in Virginia during the Revolution. And that's not uncommon. As I said, a lot of Germans stay behind. Some of the British soldiers stay behind as well. For instance, earlier I mentioned this Virginia State Regiment, Crockett's Western Battalion. Their drum major was actually a British deserter who had been captured at Saratoga, had been part of the Convention Army. He deserts and joins the Continental Army. So that's, that those situations happened as well. So there's, again, a lot of genealogical work has been done on this.
And then someone else is wondering, and Katie talked about this a little bit. I don't know if you have any other illustrations, Katie, but do the journals that you referenced, you talked a little bit about one of the people saying they were being served by an enslaved person who was practically naked. Do they have any other comments or documentation on the place of enslaved people in Virginia that they noted there?
Um, I think that Travis mentioned that um, there uh, there is a journal account that's published by Frederica Charlotte Louise Riedesel, and she talks about that while she's staying in Albemarle County. But I would recommend, yeah, check out all the primary source journals you can find. A lot of them are available online, and you can dig in and see a lot of the quotes because it was something new. And just the way that Virginia society was set up is so different to what people in Germany were experiencing, and even from the northern part of the country. So it was something that people did comment on.
And you said they commented, especially they had been in New England where the houses were better built. There were enslaved people in New England, but there was not plantations and plantation slavery. And the number of enslaved people was kind of, I guess, shocking to people to see that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, there's a lot of what we would call today culture shock for the Germans, particularly when they come to the South, both as prisoners and as soldiers in 1781. And the presence of enslaved people is one of the first things that they comment on. That particular account, particularly the description of a naked person serving, um, I was really struck by that because it exactly mirrors another firsthand account. A New Englander named Elkanah Watson is traveling through Virginia on his way to the Carolinas. And it's when he crosses Nolan's Ferry and arrives in Loudoun County, he talks about going to a home and all of the enslaved servants are nude. And people are sitting around the dinner table eating and carrying on as if this is totally normal. And that's twice that I've encountered that. And it's really, got me wondering about that practice or how commonplace that was, but it just seems so very strange.
And I know, and I'm going to see if I can, I do believe we have an entry about that in Encyclopedia of Virginia. And one of the things that does happen yeah, we do actually have an entry on clothing for enslaved people. We are very comprehensive at Encyclopedia of Virginia. I'll drop that into the chat. One of the things that is a lot of people don't realize is when we had the great textile boom in the United States with cotton in the early 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we start to see the mass manufacturing of textiles in New England. A lot of that was actually a very rough kind of fabric that was used to clothe enslaved people. It was not for export, it was not for the use of white people, it was for enslaved people. It becomes a major manufacturing area in this country, which just shows you how, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, the need for enslaved people to produce cotton creates a need for clothing made of cotton to clothe the ever-growing population of enslaved people. So that's a really bad circle there. Well, we are out of time today. I want to thank Travis and Katie and Olivia for joining us for this really fascinating discussion. We are so happy everyone was able to join us today. If you found this discussion valuable, please consider becoming a supporter of Encyclopedia Virginia. Your funding helps keep programs like this online at a time of decreased federal funding for the humanities. And I also would encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter, and I will drop a chat to that in the link, and that will help keep you up to date on our new entries, our upcoming entry points, and everything going on at Encyclopedia Virginia. Be sure to join us on June 10th for our next entry point. That will be on Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson as we debut the first full-length biography of Thomas Jefferson's wife. So please join us for that. And for anyone who does want to share this program with anyone who wasn't able to join us today, we will send everyone a recording of the program that you can share with other folks. It will be available on our YouTube channel at Virginia Humanities. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please thank our contributors, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.